But in my presentation today, I'd like to give a presentation entitled, Helping People Who Don't Want to Be Helped. Helping People Who Don't Want to Be Helped. I gave some of the same material back in 2013. I don't normally use the same title. Usually, even if I try to change the title, but I even use the same title for this one as I gave back then, even though many of the scriptures are different and some of the points are different. But in this life, why do I pick this subject? Well, I pick my subjects based on my experiences and based on the experiences of people I hang out with. So in other words, if there are people that I know who are having different challenges in life, I want to be helpful. You know, I was talking to a friend of mine recently. In their little congregation, it was brought up that one of the people in the congregation doesn't like Christian living sermons. And as it turns out, I think 98% of mine are Christian living sermons. Even if I talk about prophecy, I'll end it with Christian living. Even if I talk about doctrine, I'll end it with Christian living, because if we're not going to live it, why you even mess with it? Why talk about it? Why explore it? Why to deal with it? So again, mine are based on experiences. I have a lot of people who are having challenges. Not only people I know, but people I barely know, people I come in contact with on a first-time basis. People are having challenges, and I feel my purpose in life is trying to help people to get to the point of turning to God and let God fix their problems. Because as I've told you many times, I can't fix problems. Neither can you. And there are a lot of people there who think they can fix problems, but a lot of these problems need to be fixed by God's blessing and also maybe then sometimes professional help. But we need God involved in our life. So you're going to come across people, and those who are maybe listening on the internet, you're going to come across people who you'd like to help, but they don't want help. And that's what this is all about, trying to help people who really haven't come to you for help, don't think they need your help, and try to help you find the right way to do the best you can to help them without doing it the wrong way. Let's turn over to Proverbs chapter 26, verse 17. Proverbs chapter 26, verse 17. I love the Proverbs. When I was a teenager coming into contact with God, Proverbs was my favorite book. It makes sense then because it's so practical. And I would tell teenagers, make the Proverbs a big part of your life, because the Proverbs just make so much sense. So we see this little verse in Proverbs 26, verse 17. And obviously the point is this: it's easier to help someone if they want help. If someone says, help me with my smoking problem, it's easier to help them. If someone says, help me with my diet, it's easier to help them. If someone says, help me with my health challenges, it's easier to help them. Because if you try to give health advice to people who don't want health advice, that goes nowhere fast. If you give child-rearing advice to people who don't want to hear child-rearing advice, that doesn't go anywhere. If you give marriage advice to people who didn't come to you for marriage advice, you're not going to get very far. It's just, in other words, the best time to help someone is when they ask for help. This Proverbs 26, verse 17, very graphic. If you've been around dogs, you've been around calm dogs, you've been around mean dogs. He who passes by and meddles in a quarrel not his own is like one who takes a dog by the ears. And if you ever get, many dogs, there's some passive dogs. I know the Cartwright's grandson is one of my favorite dogs in the whole world. She, I think, is a female dog. She's so passive. Apparently, she acts like she's been abused, and so she's real passive. And of course, she loves everybody. But when I go to their house and she's there, I know she loves me best of all. Not really. She loves everybody. But she does remember that I treat her well. And it's funny to watch dogs. They know how you want to pet them. They know where, if you want to get them behind the ear. Many variations of dogs are very, very smart. So there's some dogs that are just very passive. But there are some dogs, if you get behind the ear, they'll nip at you, they'll bite you, they'll growl at you. And that's what the Bible's talking about here. If you get involved in something that you weren't invited into, boy, it can be a mess. Caution to some of you. Caution to some of you on the internet. Don't go looking to be changing people's lives. Don't go in where you've not been invited in. And again, there may be ways that you can help, and that's what I'm going to try to talk to. Don't be quick to rush into those situations. There's a scripture in 1 Peter 3 I'm not going to turn to. 1 Peter 3 verse 15 talks about be ready to give an answer always. Always be ready to give an answer, because a lot of times when people then make the request for help, you have an opportunity and you may miss that opportunity. The question may be fresh. I know years ago, churches sometimes have a lot of booklets explaining doctrinal positions or booklets explaining different ideas of life. And if someone comes up to you and says, what do you believe about such and such? And you say, wait a second, I'll get you a booklet, and it'll take about 3 or 4 days to get the booklet to you, you've missed the opportunity. When they ask you for help, that's the time to talk about it. And, booklets can be good for later on, but first of all, you're not relying on the experts of your religion, of your denomination to explain things. When someone asks you, you need to be on top of it. And of course, you want to explain it the best way possible. I tell people regularly, when people ask you a question, try to give them the 2-minute answer, because they don't want a 3-hour answer. Why do you believe in such and such? They don't want a 3-hour answer. Now, a 2-minute answer can turn into a 3-hour discussion. That's because they are now asking you questions. They are now inviting you in. They want more of your information. When people say, why do you believe what you do? They're asking for a 2-minute answer. And then if it gets longer than that, hooray, great. You now have a discussion going. So again, be prepared to give an answer. It's easy to help someone when they're seeking your help. But what about people who aren't seeking your help? Now I want to break this down into 2 categories here about people who are not receiving your help. There are some official capacities where you would take a more active role. In other words, there are some situations where if you have to jump in because it's your role. The first example of that is about parenting young children. If you parent 2-year-olds, you're going to enter into discussions that they don't ask you to be a part of. You're going to determine what they eat, when they eat it. You're going to elicit their involvement because you want to help them make choices in life. But for children, you have to make a lot of the choices for them. The younger children. Now, in a separate category, older children, which we'll look at a scripture here soon about that. Older children, you don't deal with the same way as you do a 2-year-old. You don't deal with a 25-year-old the same way you deal with a 2-year-old. You just don't. And the other thing is a job situation. If you're a boss, you have certain responsibilities that you can lay out there for your employees. And if you're an employee, realize your boss can be a little infringing. She can intrude a little bit. Because if they own the company, they can get involved in that. So I consider those things like rearing small children and bosses. I consider those like, well, there's someone, if you're a boss, you can jump in quickly on some things. If you're an employee, your boss can jump in quickly. But then there's the others. These are the others who are not necessarily have direct responsibility. These are individuals like, let's look at Ezekiel chapter 18. Ezekiel chapter 18, verses 19 and 20. Here's where you're still the parent. But as you're the parent, your relationship is different now that your child is older. Now that your children are older, your relationship is different. So you may still jump in, but you will not jump in the same way, because you don't treat a 2-year-old the same way you treat a 25-year-old. As your children are away from you, especially if they're out of college and they've moved away from your home, they may live in your city, they may not live in your city. Of course, that comes into play too of what relationship you have with them. But again, with your kids, if they don't want help, it says here, Ezekiel 18 is a beautiful chapter. On 2 occasions in verses 4 and 20, it says, the soul that sins shall die. You've heard that expression? The soul that sins shall die. Basically, that means is each individual gives account for his life. The soul of the living being gives account for his life. And it talks in there about if the dad's wrong, he gives account for his life. If the kid's wrong, he gives account for his life. And it gives the contrast of different relationships. So in verses 19 and 20, it says, yet you shall say, why should the son not bear the guilt of his father? Because the son has done what is lawful and right, has kept all of my statutes and done them. he shall surely live. The soul who sins shall die. The son shall not bear the guilt of the father, nor shall the father bear the guilt of the son. The righteousness of the righteous shall be upon himself, and the wickedness of the wicked shall be upon himself. You give account for how you deal with your 2-year-old, but you also give account for how you deal with your 25-year-old, although they are now assuming more responsibility. At what age, of course, this is the individual family decides this, at what age do you pass on different responsibilities? At what age do you pass on different responsibilities to your children about going to church, how they keep the Sabbath, all these different things, and this varies from family to family. And of course, I support the family's right, the sovereign right to decide those things. Families can talk to other families, how did you do it? How would you do it? But that's, again, can be sharing of advice, sharing of information. Each family decides those things as you deal with it. At what age does your teenager date? What are the rules of dating? Those are decided by the individual family. We can have opinions, even our teen leaders. Our teen leaders can state opinions, but they do not dictate to the families what the families do. And in fact, usually, if they sit quiet, the families will talk. The teenagers will certainly talk. Of course, teen leaders have to be careful not to get sucked in the middle there. The teenagers will ask questions, and certainly the parents will ask questions. If people ask me as the pastor, when do you think my teenager should date? Well, I don't have an arbitrary number on that. It's very individual. And I'll be happy to give my opinion on those things, and I'm really happy if they don't ask me about those things. I'm happy for them to run their lives. I'm more than willing to talk about things. I just don't have to run those things. I don't have to deal with those things. People give account for themselves. So again, there's going to be a little difference then if when you help your 16-year-old buy their first car, you're going to be more involved than if your 38-year-old or 48-year-old asks you, what kind of car do you think I should get? And this all makes perfect sense, but we're stating this because I'm having some real advice for you here at the end here. Now, on the handout, I put marriage roles in a difference than parenting roles. And I want to take a little time to explain that. In other words, I put the marriage role different more as a fluid situation where we definitely know that the parent is in charge of their kids. The reason being, there are some people in marriage who think the husband is the head in a way that is more like a parent. And I think that's a horrible mistake to make. I mean, you hear people joke about, and apparently this happens, so it's not a joke when it really happens. But apparently in society years ago, husbands have spanked their wives. I know it's been a long time ago, but that has happened many years ago, and probably has happened in a couple church families because any religious people tend to have very strict rules about that. But husbands should not be spanking their wives in a controlling fashion. Should not be. And so again, while Ephesians 5, someone says, yeah, but Ephesians 5 says husbands should love their wives and wives should respect or submit to their husbands. I know what it says. I support what it says. But I'm going to repeat to you what I've said before. It's not important. I think Ephesians 5 is very important. In fact, when I do pre-marriage counseling for people, I ask them, how do you view Ephesians 5? And then the man and the woman will talk about how they view Ephesians 5. I say, okay, you two need to be in agreement on this. See, I don't think all of us have to agree on this. In other words, Pam and I do not have to agree about Ephesians 5 the same way Ron and Linda look at it, or the same way Neil and Martha look at it, or the same way Reg and Carol look at it. And I can pick every one of you who's married. We don't have to be exactly the same on it. We're going to be close. I mean, we're all going to be close, but we don't have to be exactly the same on it. But what's important is Pam and I should be on the same page, which thankfully we are. And I hope you are on the same page with your spouse. Now that does change through the years, by the way, because you get married a lot of people get married when they're young, and then life's experiences come up, and sometimes those views change. And if you're in some situations where they've changed and if you've grown farther apart on that, I feel sorry for you, but you have to, with God's help, you're going to have to deal with that. But the fact is, you need to work with your spouse and try to be on the same page, but we all don't have to look at it exactly the same way. Husbands don't all have to act the same way. Wives don't all have to act the same way. Certain freedoms will be given more. In some families, certain freedoms will be given to the wife. I think I told you about the lady I met. Claire was her name. Claire, was it Claire, the lady over in, she's a Jewish lady by descent. She became Church of God 3 years ago. She's about 71. And through the years, I've mentioned this before, through the years, when I came out of a college that taught us about Ephesians 5, I could not go to the families I grew up in back in Pennsylvania area and New York City area. I could not go back there and try to put them into a certain mold that everyone had to fit. Because, as I mentioned before, many of the Italian families up there, the way they ran very successfully is Mama ran a lot of the details. But when Papa put his foot down, she listened. And Papa was happy for Mama to run a lot of the details. Well, when I talked to Claire, who's from New York City, not only did I grow up around Italian families, I grew up around a lot of Jewish families. And Claire was saying in her household, her husband dealt with everything outside the house. And she was the queen and king of everything inside the house. Now, some of you might say in your marriage, you don't do it that way. Some of you want the husband to be more involved in those things. You do what works for the two of you. People have to decide what works for them. But it got me thinking, that's right, I've seen so many of the Jewish families, it's like, outside the house, you take care of it. Inside, this is my house, and I'm going to set the rules for how things happen inside this house. And she asserted herself very strongly in doing so. And I thought, yeah, I should have thought about that all these years. All the families I grew up around, I saw a lot of strong women. And that didn't bother me. That was just the way it was. So to try to say we're going to force all these cookie cutter marriages together, as I'm telling you, please understand, you decide how you and your spouse work on how you make Ephesians 5 work. You need to be on the same page. We can have variety amongst us. So I'm pointing that out is people don't all think the same things. Also in congregations, I don't believe that the pastor or anyone who's a leader, and you should all be leaders, I don't think I am like an employer. I don't think I'm like an employee. I don't have authority over you that way. Now, so you may say, yeah, but you have friends in other churches of God where the ministers have exercised a lot of authority over you or over them. That's their business. The way I look at it is the Pope can run the Catholic Church any way he wants to. It has no effect on me. But if you go to the Catholic Church, be alert, that's what you're going to be dealing with. If you look at the other churches of God, in a Baptist church, many of the deacons run the Baptist church. I know from my wife's experiences that was true. But again, every situation is different. When you look at a church, some are more hierarchical, some are more organized. Well, that's the way they've chosen to structure themselves. They probably use the Bible to defend why they do it. That doesn't necessarily make it from God, but at least they're trying to use the Bible to defend why they do it. What they do doesn't affect me in any way. It only affects me if I chose to go there. If I chose to go there, then they would affect me. Otherwise, it has no effect on me at all. Galatians 6:1 talks about to help people. If you see someone overtaken in a fault. Let's look at Galatians 6:1. I'm giving you a lot of the breakdown here of different groups. Galatians 6:1 says, "Brethren, if a man be overtaken in any trespass, you who are spiritual, restore such a one in the spirit of gentleness, considering yourself lest you also be tempted." Okay, helping someone who doesn't want to be helped. You have no authority over people to do this. Like I said, this is different. A parent has authority over their child. Marriages have certain authority that they agree upon. Employers definitely have authority over their employees. You as a church brother or sister in Christ, you have no authority over other people, but you may have the opportunity to help them. So if you see someone who's overtaken in a trespass, while you have no authority over them, how are you going to help them? Well, the first question should be, are you the right one to help them? Are you the one to help them? By the way, my philosophy here in pastoring this church is best person for the job. Best person for the job. That's why if you want to talk to me about any subject, I'm willing to listen. But if you want to talk to one of your brethren in the congregation here about something, I'm not offended. You might say, well, Dave, you're the pastor. If I have a financial question, don't I have to come to you? No, you don't have to come to me. Can I come to you? Sure. I remember 20 years ago when I tried to encourage people to go to a variety of people for anointings. One of the widows came up to me and said, are you saying you don't want to anoint us anymore? I said, no, I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying you have the freedom to go to whomever you want to go to. I'm not going to take it personally if you go to someone else. But see, they were used to all anointings had to go through the pastor in their previous church. So that was a new change for them. I'm saying, no, in our church, you don't have to come to me for anointings. You don't have to come to me for child-rearing advice. You don't have to come to me for marriage advice. You can come to me for anything, but you don't have to. And so a lot of people, I still anoint a lot of people. I still give advice to a lot of people. But if you want to talk amongst yourself, I would say this, to whomever you go to someone you trust. Just make sure someone you trust. If a person's overtaken in a fault, you who are spiritual, are you the right one to help them? Can you help them? And if you can't help them, you just tell them, I don't think I'm the right person for the job. You know, I think I've told you before, I was up on a church visit, and there were 5 of us sitting around talking. It was a couple, one man and wife, and another couple, man and wife. And since my wife doesn't travel with me, I was the 5th one. And this one girl was wanting to get married. And we were all concerned about her choice. We were concerned like, is this going to work? And so we were saying, well, who should talk to her? And I specifically said, best person for the job. I don't think I'm the best person for the job, but if you think I'm the best person for the job, I will get an airline ticket, make a church visit in that area, and I will get alone with this individual, and I will tell her my personal thoughts of what I think she needs to consider before she goes forward in marriage. Best person for the job. I said, I'm not looking for work to do. I'm busy enough, but if you think I'm the best person for the job, I'll do it. As it turned out, we thought one of the women was the best person for the job, which made sense to me. And so the lady talked to her. But that's the way I feel here. Best person for the job. I'm willing to work hard for this congregation, but I'll do a lot, I'll do enough. But there's some things I don't have no problem. When I'm dealing with young teenagers in trouble, when you deal with teenagers in trouble, teenagers have drug problem or whatever. When I talk to the parent, I'll say, who's the best person to talk to your teenager? If you think I am, I will. But maybe it's an Aunt Betsy who's not in the Church of God. Maybe it's an Uncle Frank who's a Jehovah's Witness. Maybe it's a Gertrude who's a Baptist. In other words, we're not worrying about the title. We're worried about who is connected to this person that can really reach out and help this person. Best person for the job. But it says here, when you do help, you help in the spirit of gentleness. So again, we're talking about helping people who don't want to be helped. If you're the best person for the job, or if you're a good person for the job, is your approach going to be profitable? You say, well, I'm just going to go in there guns a-blazing. Is that the best approach? Is guns a-blazing the best approach? If it's the best approach, go in guns a-blazing. But a lot of times guns a-blazing is not the best approach. So you want the best person for the job. You want the best approach for the job because we're trying to help people who don't want to be helped. Of course, we had the interactive Bible study, and Becky mentioned, again, a good example, she said, and I wanted to make sure to say her name because I've been calling her Betty. Sorry, Becky. That was my way of helping remember. But Becky brought up in the interactive study, she said, it's going to be someone who cares for you. Doesn't that make some sense? Doesn't it make a lot of sense? If you're going to help someone, they need to feel you care for them. Now, there are sometimes it can be a hard-nosed person good cop, bad cop kind of thing. It can be some of that too. But how you care for someone is very, very important. Let's look at three final, my last minutes here, look at three helpful reminders about helping people. 1 Corinthians 3, verses 6 and 7. 1 Corinthians 3, verses 6 and 7. Paul wrote, I planted, Apollos watered, God gave the increase. So then neither is he that plants anything, neither is he that waters, but God who gives the increase. Brethren, do not try to run over people. Do not try to cram information down their throat. Don't cram religious information down people's throat. Don't cram health information down people's throat. Don't cram financial information down people's throat. Don't cram Bible prophecy down people's throat. You say, I know people who do that all the time. Yeah, I know people who try to do that all the time, and I guess some people allow that. But don't try to cram. Even people who want the information don't cram it. But especially if people don't want the help. That's not going to help. I recommend you follow what Paul said. Plant and water. Now, actually, someone in the study made a nice comment, a compliment to myself, but I'm glad they recognize that this is what I try to do for 20 years. I'm trying to plant and water from this pulpit. I'm also trying to plant and water in personal conversation. Plant and water. Don't cram. And someone can say, well, yeah, but I want a strong approach. Well, I recommend the biblical approach of planting and watering and let God give the increase. Because remember I talked about I'm dealing with a lot of people. I can't fix their problems. But if I can plant and water them to look to God who can fix their problems, their life can get better. Believe me, there are a lot of religious people out there. There are religious people in the Church of God out there who think they have all the answers, but they have no experience of how to help people. They've studied things, and when they study things, they sure memorize the facts, and they like to throw the facts out to people, but they don't know how to help people. I recommend, as you're trying to help people who don't want help, plant and water. The next section is 1 Corinthians 9, verses 19 through 23. And again, we've spent a lot, this section can take a whole sermon, but I'm just going to quickly look at the verses here. What Paul said was, though I'm free from all men, I've made myself a servant to all that I may win the more. He talked about understanding the way people live. If you want to help someone understand something about their life, why do they have a temper problem? Why do they have a gambling problem? Why do they have a drinking problem? If you don't know anything about them, you can just quote facts from Wikipedia or from the internet or a book you've read, and is it really going to make the connection that you want it to make? Because he talks about how to talk with a Jewish person, how to talk with someone under the law, how does someone talk about without the law, and how to talk to a weak person. Brethren, many people in the Church of God are pretty decent about talking to people dealing with the law of God. Unfortunately, they're really not good about how to reach people. And quite frankly, most of the people I deal in life are weak people. And how well are you prepared to help weak people? Help weak people because do you try to understand why they're weak? Do you understand the factors in their life? Do you understand those things? All of us need to do a better job of that. The point being, Paul's saying here, we look at these 4 points, and there could be other ways of describing it, but we look at these 4 areas, and we try to recognize the world they're in. The last one is 2 Corinthians 10, verses 1 and 2. 2 Corinthians 10, verses 1 and 2 talks about trying to be meek first. And I've mentioned this before, and I've used teachers as an example, and so you know I've made this example many times, that if you're in a classroom, you have to start out strong first, and you can always soften up. You start off too weak, it's hard to get back on top of it after you let too much go. Every time I mention it, all the teachers agree with me on that. And there are some situations where that is true, that you want to do that. I have written on the handout, the more carnal and immature the audience, the quicker boldness must be applied to establish a firm foundation. If your audience, whether it's a group or a person, if your audience is carnal and immature, you may have to go to boldness faster. A boss may have to do that. A boss may say, if I'm too soft early, I have real problems. I also say on the handout, the more spiritual and mature the audience, the more meekness can be tried. How should it be in a married couple, husbands and wives dealing with each other? Should be meekness. If married couples can use meekness, that means there's a lot of spirituality there, and there's a lot of maturity there. If you're dealing with someone who's not very mature or someone who's not very spiritual minded, you may not be able to start with meekness too much because your meekness will be perceived as weakness. You're going to have to make that determination. You're going to have to size that up. You're going to have to size it up as in this situation, whether it be in a classroom, a job, a congregation, a neighbor, the carnality of, if a person's really a carnal person, if your neighbor's a carnal person who's always coming out threatening you and shooting guns up in the air, probably meekness is not going to be the best thing to start with. I mean, you're going to be careful not to be too strong because you don't want to get in a pistol fight right in your neighbor. But you have to size up. Is this person a person of bluster? Or is this person calm and reasonable? As you size it up, you'll be able to determine which way you'll do it. But see, 2 Corinthians 10, verses 1 and 2, I, Paul, myself, am pleading with you by the meekness and gentleness of Christ, who in presence am lowly among you, but absent I'm bold toward you. I beg you that when I am present, that I don't have to be bold with you. I recommend congregations, pastors, be meek. We say, well, Dave, you're assuming the congregation is spiritual. Yes. You're assuming the congregation is mature. Yes. But what if a congregation is not very spiritual and not very mature? I still recommend pastors, board members, church teachers, leaders in the congregation, everybody in the congregation seek to be meek. If you have to go to boldness, if there's ever a need to go to boldness, do that. Well, Dave, you're giving the congregation, you're giving every congregation the benefit of the doubt. Yes, the congregation is not like a job. The congregation is not like a hierarchy of this looking down and abusing people. It's not that way. It should not be that way at all. So yes, I'm encouraging anyone listening to whatever your congregation you go to, that you would consider being meek. So again, the three reminders: plant and water, try to recognize the world people live in, and try meekness and gentleness first, and progress to the appropriate boldness if necessary. And I hope that these little things, these little pieces of advice, these little words can help people who don't want to be helped.